Hello, 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 ladies and gentlemen and others. Thank you for joining today's The Sample webinar. I'm your host, Dominic Weber, coming to you from the mountains of Colorado. I am the director of the Flair team, having been with Mandiant since 2015. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce you to today's session presented by the Flair team. Flair is a 35-person reverse engineering and exploit hunting team in Mandiant and Google that analyzes thousands of samples each year. We like to share our unique experiences with the world so that they won't be lost in time like tears in rain. Today, we're thrilled to share a fun and interesting malware analysis story with you. We've been doing this for years internally already, and it's always a great hit. Next slide. We also have an annual CTF called the Flare On Challenge. And today, on this very day, we start the 9th installment. Try it out and see how far you get. It is a ton of fun. But first, we will wait for 3 minutes for others to join, listening to a little bit of live hold music from Kelly Sexcron. Welcome, welcome, welcome back. Thank you, Kelly Sextron, for some extraordinary space sounds. Today, Blaine Stansel will present on his fascinating experience with White Dagger. Blaine Stansel is a principal reverse engineer on Mandiant and Google's Flare team. He has authored 4 Flare on challenges and is a developer for Flare VM. He leads Flare's mentoring efforts and is teaching Flare EDU courses around the world. Prior to joining Flare, Blaine worked as a malware researcher with endpoints and as a security analyst with the Department of Defense. Outside of work, Blaine enjoys gardening, DIY projects, and his big fluffy cat. If you have any questions, please post them to the chat so we can answer them at the end. The presentation will take about 30 minutes. An on-demand webinar recording will be sent to all those who registered and all who attended after the event. And without further ado, Blaine, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Dom. So let's dive in. And we're going to start with a story time, because who doesn't love a great story? And so this is going to be a story about a time that I got the opportunity to analyze a memory-only dropper. And the story starts a little something like this. I was drinking my morning coffee, just sat down at my computer, and took the first ticket on our never-ending malware queue. Now for this sample, it's in the top left. That's the hash if you'd like to download it. You can also provide those in chat later. Now the requester for this ticket, the request goes a little something like this. Hi Flare team, I found this memory-only dropper and we're gonna call it White Dagger. I've seen it dropping some Cobalt Strike shellcode. Now I've also found 2 other samples that look pretty similar and have a similar decryption routine, but they're dropping different payloads. They've seen Rook and Bazaar Loader. Can you please analyze these and see if they're all pretty much the same thing? All right, before we get too far, let's all make sure that we know what a dropper is. So a dropper is a piece of malware that is designed to house additional embedded payloads. And it kind of looks like a Russian nesting doll. So our little blob people here, you start with the main dropper, and it can have an additional second stage or even a third stage, so on and so forth, until you get to the final payload. Now that final payload is what we as malware analysts are most interested in. So that's our goal when we're trying to analyze droppers, is to get that payload. Now there's 2 main types of droppers. The typical dropper will take the next stage or the payload and write it to disk and then execute it. Now memory-only droppers is the other type, and their payloads never touch disk. They either inject them into a separate process or load them into memory in their own process. Now, the goals from a dropper's perspective, the dropper's trying to hide the payload and increase the cost that it will cost us as the analysts to extract that payload. They're trying to hide the final payload from both EDR products and analysts. Now, droppers are layered like an onion. You can think of it that way. All these layers with the payload at the center. And these layers are swappable. You can swap them out for different droppers, or maybe a dropper becomes too common. You can just burn it, peel that layer off, and add a new one. And that keeps your payload alive longer, if that makes sense. All right, so now that we all know what a dropper is, let's just recap real quick on the analysis request. We had this memory-only dropper that we're tracking as WHITEDAGGER, and we've seen it dropping multiple different payloads, but they all kind of use a similar crypto routine. The main ask of the ticket was to please compare these samples and see if they're the same thing. So that's where my journey starts. Now, anytime I take a ticket that says, please compare samples or something similar, I just light up. I get super excited. And not everyone on the team does, but I do. The reason is there's some assumption of similarity from the beginning. Someone has an inkling that these samples are somewhat similar. And generally, the requester will submit a sample that we've usually already analyzed or has prior analysis. And what I love about that is then I can read a colleague's FLAIR report, get a good detailed understanding of how it works, and likely will also have a labeled IDB. And what that does is it gives me like a roadmap or a guiding line to follow when I'm comparing these samples. And it becomes pretty obvious if these samples are similar, the roadmaps or the code flow will line up pretty well, or if they're very different or divergent, it'll be pretty obvious. And what that means is I don't have to start from scratch every time. And it generally gives me less work to do or less effort, and that's a big win. So I get very excited for these kind of tickets, and I think they're pretty fun. Okay, so here's our sample again, this WHITEDAGGER sample. The hash is in the top left. Let's dive in and let's talk about the internals of it. Now, I will mention up front in this sample, there was a lot of junk code and dummy code. And the program itself looked benign. I had to dig around for a while to try to find the beginning of some type of evil code flow, if you will. So the malware author was trying to purposely hide this evil code in what looked like the inside of some type of open source project. So it took a little bit of rummaging around, but eventually I found the beginning. And the malicious code flow started with dynamic API resolution. Now, what does this mean? This means that these Windows APIs or these functions are not inside of the import table. The malware will actually resolve these at runtime. And if you've never seen how that works, this is typically how it works. We have some disassembly over on the right. Now, in this disassembly at the top, we have what's called a hash value. You can think of that just as a numerical number that maps to one of these API strings. And let's say we're trying to find virtual alloc. So we have this hash for virtual alloc. It represents virtual alloc. We're going to pass this hash value as an argument to the next function. And that function's job is to now go and resolve and find the function pointer to virtual alloc. It will return it, and then we can eventually call it like below. And we see we're just calling a register like EBX. So at first glance, it's not very obvious what function we're calling. All right, so how does that function work that's actually going to resolve this API using a hash? What that function will do is actually parse a DLL in memory, for instance, kernel 32. It'll parse its PE header, find its way down to its export table, and then start hashing each export one at a time by taking that export string, for instance, find resource A, take that string, run it through a hashing algorithm, which will output a hash value, and then compare to the one that it's interested in. In this case, it's not find resource A. Let's try the next one. Nope, not that one either. But finally, we found a matching hash. There we go, we found virtual alloc. So that's how that process works internally for most malware samples, and in this case, WHITEDAGGER. All right, let's recap and go back to our evil code flow. So now we've resolved some Windows functions. Next, what WHITEDAGGER will do is It will load an embedded resource from its resource section and actually copy that into newly allocated memory. And what's interesting here is that newly allocated memory has read, write, and execute permissions. And immediately that smells kind of fishy to me. It gets my malware analysis senses tingling, because read, write, and executable, it almost never should be executable memory. So likely something bad's going to go there. After it's loaded that resource into that buffer, it's going to decrypt that executable memory blob and then finally execute it. So there we go. It's actually pretty short, and this is the heart of WhiteDagger. It kind of looks generic, but at the end of the day, it's just going to execute a blob of memory. And that'll pretty much be shellcode. It's just going to put the instruction pointer at that blob and let it rip. All right, so let's do the comparison. So between all three of these samples, the similarities were that they all had the same evil code flow. They all resolved these dynamic APIs, loaded, decrypted, and executed a resource. And they did so in a manner that it's obvious at a disassembly level that it was the same malware author who created these. But there were a lot of differences between them. They had different payloads. There was a lot of inlining versus non-inlining code, and that's usually due to compiler optimizations. And what that means is instead of calling a function, they've taken the guts of the function and just copied and pasted verbatim into a larger function. So it makes the other function much larger. Then they also had different hashing algorithms. They still used the hashing algorithm, but the mechanism to generate the hash was different. And lastly, there was just lots of dummy code, like code that doesn't do anything. Think about like dead code, junk code. And they were all, the evil code was all embedded inside of different benign programs. So that's really odd. It looked like the malware author was purposely trying to disguise their program. And so I got interested and wanted to see, the TLDR is that they're all the same, but kind of different, but still the same. Like our little virus guys over here, they're all different colors, but they're all still the same. So I got interested and wanted to see what types of different programs was the author embedding these in. So I pulled what's called a PDB path, which is a program, database. It's a string that gets compiled into what are called like debug builds. And sometimes in release builds, if you forget to remove that artifact, and it's usually really good to use for attribution purposes because it gives you the full build path of your program, which can include the username of the person who actually crafted the malware. Now these are kind of small, so on the next slide, I tried to make them a little bit larger. And I extracted all these PDB paths just using a simple tool like strings. All right, so here they are. It looks like during upload, my strings got kind of shifted here. So apologies if the boxes don't line up. All right, so here's just a few of them. And we can see there's lots of different sources. The top little chunk I tried to highlight, the malware author was pulling from ExploitDB. Just if you're trying to make malware and disguise it as goodware, it's an odd place to start with, but they used it. Down below, we see a big chunk from the Windows SDK, these like sample executables, if you will. And then at the bottom, I was trying to highlight a username called Mr. Anderson, which isn't very telling, but maybe the author is a fan of the Matrix. I'm not sure. So what else could I learn from these build paths? Again, my red boxes are shifted to the right. They should be more left. I'm trying to highlight the years here. We can see that the author used different Visual Studio versions to compile these from 2003 all the way up to 2013. And that probably explains the different optimizations to do inlining versus non-inlining. And they also chose to do different architectures from x86 to x64. So they're really trying hard to disguise their evil code as open source programs. That's an interesting tradecraft. Okay, so I wanted to think about how would I do this if I was the malware author? So this is just my guess, completely off the cuff. I have no idea if this is correct. So anyway, let's go for it. I'm going to assume that they have some sort of dropper source code. And then they probably have customers, if you will, people that will contact them and say, hey, I'd like you to craft me a custom dropper with my payload. So they need someone else's payload code. Then what they probably do is take their dropper source code and run it through some type of mutation engine that will maybe select a different hashing algorithm, sprinkle in some junk code, and of course, encrypt the payload so that way the dropper knows how to decrypt it. And then the output will likely be updated dropper source code and an encrypted payload. Now from there, the interesting part is they probably go out onto the internet, Google around, find some probably open source GitHub project, pull it down, and then just stuff in their new dropper code somewhere, as well as add the encrypted payload as one of the resources during the compilation process. Run it all through the compiler, which can choose different optimization levels. And what do you get? Well, you get something that looks pretty benign, right? Like we never know this was a virus. And there you go, good to go. So this is just my guess. Don't quote me. But now you have to ask yourself, why would they be doing this? And I have two guesses as well. The first is probably machine learning evasion. They want to get around these machine learning algorithms. Now, machine learning algorithms are almost overly trained on malicious samples. So they're really good at sniffing out evil. But what they're not really good at is when they look at benign samples, they're probably just going to say, yeah, you're benign because I'm trained to look for evil. So as long as you kind of look benign, you're stuffed in a benign program, it'll just fly through the radar, no problem. And I did test a few of these samples on some of our internal machine learning algorithms, and yeah, they just fly by. The other is probably just death by variance. It's going to generate a ton of different variants, which makes it hard to signature and easily identify. And so then I'll wind up, me as the analyst, getting a ton of these and having to say, yes, this is WHITEDAGGER. Yes, this is WHITEDAGGER. Yes, yes, yes. A lot of requests. So overall, it's just really annoying. Okay, so at this point, my ticket, going back to our story, I've compared them all. And yes, they're all the same, a little different, but they are all still the same. But I got to thinking, that similar crypto. Now, when we're analyzing droppers, we as malware analysts, we can kind of sometimes just skip past the crypto, if you will, because we're just trying to get the payload. And we can do that either statically, if we understand how to decrypt it, or we can run it dynamically and dump it. As long as we get the payload, we're usually good. So sometimes we can just overlook the details, like in this case, the encryption algorithm. But I started wondering, kept eating at me. And you reach a certain junction as an analyst. You want to be both efficient, but yet accurate. And so I had to make a decision. Should I close the ticket and just move on to the next one? I mean, I've answered the request, or should I dive deeper? Should I really figure out how this algorithm works? And so I decided it was worth the cost, and I was like, let's dive a little bit deeper. So I did, and we're going to today. So get ready, let's dive in. All right, here's some decompilation from WHITEDAGGER, and this is about the cleanest decompilation I could find. Now, I mentioned there's lots of junk code and dummy code, so I had to troll around quite a bit, and this is the best I could find. I know there's a lot here, but don't worry, I'm gonna break it down to the most basic components. In the first part, we're gonna start with this API called crypt import key. This Windows API key is responsible for importing a key into the Windows crypto system. And what we're importing here is going to be an asymmetric private key. It's called a private key blob. You're going to hear the word blob a lot. All right, so we've imported our private key. Next, what we're going to do, we have two parts in this one. We have a simple key blob that's highlighted on the bottom. And we're going to use the highlighted portion on the top, which is a 16-byte key. And we're going to overwrite the simple key blob at a fixed offset, but in reverse. And that's really weird. Like, it's really weird to see a loop writing data in reverse versus forward. It's almost always forward. I think this is the only time I've seen it backwards. So really odd. All right, and this is a different blob, and we'll talk about that soon. All right, step 3. Again, we're calling crypt import key. And this time we're using the private key from before, and we're passing in the simple key blob. Now, what's happening in this step is that private key is decrypting the data in the simple key blob. And then finally, we're going to decrypt data by, oddly enough, calling crypt encrypt. I mean, it's not too weird, but it is kind of odd, right? We're calling crypt encrypt instead of crypt decrypt. Now, if it's a asymmetric key, that's weird. If it's a symmetric key, not too weird, because that same call does the same thing. It can encrypt and decrypt because it's a symmetric key. But anyway, let's keep that in mind. Now, from just looking at this, it's really hard to figure out what's going on. Like, I don't know what's going on. So we need to dive a little bit deeper. Okay, I realize there's a lot of bytes on the screen. Don't let it freak you out. We will do it one little bit at a time. So let's start at the top. This is that 16-byte key that I mentioned that we're actually going to write in reverse. It's 16 bytes, and in this case, it's a string. It's a null terminated string. And the null terminator is actually the 16th byte. That got me for a little bit, but not too bad. All right, here's our simple key blob, and I'm going to represent it with this little blob guy I drew. Okay, so this simple key blob is a data structure called a simple blob. And it starts off with a public key struct header, followed by some type of algorithm ID, and then finally followed by what's called the encrypted key. So a simple blob or simple key blob, its goal is to store an encrypted key inside of itself. So here I represent that with this key inside of this locked blob. And we can use this to both store and transport this data. Now the header at the top tells us what type of key is encrypted and stored inside of this simple key blob. And in our case, it's an RC4 key. All right, on the bottom, our last blob is the private key blob. So this is an asymmetric RSA private key. And its goal is to decrypt the stored encrypted key inside of the simple blob. So you can think about that as the key that unlocks our blob person on the right. Now, what's interesting about this private key is at the very bottom, we have this thing called the private exponent. And in our case, it's the number 1. Now, if we think back to math class, if we raise anything to the power of 1, we get that anything back. So in essence, this private key blob is what's called a do-nothing key. And that took me a while to figure out, but that was my aha moment. The data that's decrypted is really just the original data. It does nothing. So this private key is literally a do-nothing key. It does absolutely nothing to the original data. It doesn't actually decrypt it or encrypt it, which is really weird. So our blob just stays the same. All right, so recapping, what's actually happening here? So we're going to import the private key. We're going to essentially fill in our simple blob key with our actual RC4 key, decrypt it by doing nothing, so it's still that RC4 key, and then use it with crypt encrypt, which now makes sense because we have a symmetric RC4 key. So the long way of saying this is we're doing RC4 the hard way, or at least I think it's a pretty roundabout way to do RC4 with the Windows Crypto API. Interesting. So if we wanted to go about figuring out, hey, well, how should I actually do RC4 with the Windows Crypto API? You'll probably wind up on a page like this called Encrypting Data. I know I did. And I started reading it. You'll see maybe the mention of RC4 in here. There's lots and lots of different Windows APIs, lots of text. And I'll just be honest, it's a little dry and kind of boring. So, I mean, if you're like me and probably a lot of other developers, what do? Well, you go Google it. That's what we all do. Let's just be honest. So I Googled around quite a bit looking for, hey, how do I do RC4 with the Windows Crypto API? And I eventually found this MSDN forum right here entitled RC4 and Crypto API. I'm like, perfect. This is what I need. And if you start reading some of the posted answers, one person said, hey, go look at this other article. They'll tell you how to set the RC4 key in the Windows Crypto API. So there's the link. It's still up today. You can go see it. So that's exactly what I did. I navigated to that blog and started reading it. Now there's a lot of text on this blog too, but what they basically say is in this enlarged portion that you can pretty much get a key in 3 different ways. They tell you crypt gen key, crypt derive key, and crypt import key. Now we've seen that last one, but the most important part is highlighted in yellow at the bottom. They say explicitly that none of these 3 ways will allow you to explicitly set your key unless you use this weird do nothing key. And then I'm like, oh, a do nothing key, I've seen this. Keep talking. Tell me more. So I scrolled down a little further. And here we go. I saw two blobs or two structures of data. The one on the left is entitled private key with exponent of 1. I'm like, yes, I have seen this exact structure byte for byte. And if you look in the comment at the top, it actually says, hey, you can set an RC4 key only using this one trick. I mean, that sounds like clickbait, but then the blob on the right is our simple key blob. They call it a template. It has a header. They fill in the header with the RC4 key saying, hey, yes, what's stored is an RC4 key. And then you'll notice down at the bottom, they say, okay, here's where the key material goes. And you should use a 16-byte key, but it goes in reverse. So now I'm like, yes, I have seen this in reverse. So keep scrolling, and sure enough, I get source code. Now this should look pretty familiar. It has the same basic 4 steps. They import that private key blob, overwrite the simple key backwards, decrypt to do nothing with that simple key blob, and then finally decrypt the payload, yes, using the same crypt-encrypt API. So if I had to guess, I would say that the White Dagger malware authors probably stumbled across this exact same blog and did a little copy pasta. But I'm okay with that. All right, so all of this should be RC4, but I'm a big fan of the Trust but Verify Club. So what do I do at this point? Well, I took that encrypted payload, threw it into CyberChef, and threw some recipes for RC4. And this is where I got a little stumped, figuring out that the 16th byte was the null terminator. But I eventually got it. And sure enough, it is shellcode, exactly what I was expecting. So boom, nail into the coffin. Okay, but how can we actually do this? I'm going to say the easy way. I wouldn't say the right way, but let's go with the easy way. So how do we do RC4 with the Windows Crypto API? Well, if you get to this lovely crypt import key API on MSDN, you start reading it, eventually you'll work your way all the way down to the remarks. If you've ever read the MSDN documentation, this is where the good stuff is. Like, never skip the remarks. It's the most important part. And if you start reading these remarks, it will tell you that yes, you can in fact import a plain text key. You just need to use something called the plain text key blob. Oh, just a different blob. There we go. They have links to an example program, and they show you how to set the header as well. Boom. Now this data structure called the plain text key blob, it's not too different from our other blobs. It still has a blob header, then followed by key size, and then just the key data. So we don't need to use a simple key blob, just a plain text key blob. Okay, so I made some source code to make sure that, yes, let's verify that this works. It's not the best code, so please don't criticize it too much. I just wanted to fit it on one slide. All right, the first thing we do is we define our structure for the plain text key blob. Now, according to MSDN, that should be available from the wincrypt.h header file, but for the life of me, I couldn't find it in there. So I just defined it. The compiler never complained. So there we go. I defined it here. Next, we set the blob header with the appropriate fields. We're letting it know, yes, it's a plain text key blob, and that the embedded key is an RC4 key. Finally, I call memcopy just to copy in my plain text key. Nothing fancy here. And then finally, we use our Windows Crypto API to both import the key and then use it. And in this case, I also just happened to use crypt-encrypt. I could have also used crypt-decrypt. Like I said, it's a symmetric key, so it doesn't matter which one you call. And there we go. So that is RC4 the easy way, using the Windows Crypto API. So if you didn't know, now you do. All right, so at this point, my ticket is really done. But again, I'm at a junction. Should I close the ticket or should I capture the knowledge? And I really encourage everyone, if you've spent a lot of time doing some research, please try to codify your knowledge to help both yourself and your colleagues and your future self, because sometimes you'll look back and be like, how did I do this? So that's what I did. The first way I captured this knowledge was creating a Kappa rule. If you're not familiar with Kappa, it's an open source tool that Flare develops. It allows you to extract features from an executable, and then at the end, let you know what are the potential capabilities that the sample might do. So the meat and potatoes of my rule here looks for a few features. It looks to make sure that the function has the crypt import key API, a few different sizes for the size of our blob data structures, as well as their corresponding bytes. And then it also has to have a loop because we're looking to make sure that it overwrites that key backwards. So this is my rule. It's already available. The links for Kappa are at the bottom, both the tool and the rule database. And there you go. So if this rule hits, it could be WHITEDAGGER or just someone else doing RC4 the hard way. Now, the other thing I wanted to do was generate some type of Yarrow rule to go hunt for these samples. So I could throw out a pretty wide net and try to find more WHITEDAGGER samples. Now, again, I'm saying a wide net, so I'm not trying to make a blocking rule per se, just like a hunting rule. And since there's so much junk code, it's going to be hard to signature the bytes or the instructions. So I did think about what are some of the things that we observed in these samples. The first is that it has an encrypted payload, which will be located in the resource section. And specifically, if we were to look at all the resources, we're looking for one that has high entropy. Entropy is just a measure of randomness. It goes from 0 being completely not random all the way up to 8 being very random. And since we're using encryption, we should expect the entropy to be high, just random data, or it should look like that. And in our case, in this sample, we have one resource with an entropy of 7.7. That's really high. So keep that in mind. Okay, so again, it has this odd RC4 implementation. I probably won't be able to signature the instructions, but we do have these static bytes from the byte blobs. So I can use the simple blob header as well as all the bytes for the private key. Now, I'm not going to use the bytes following the simple blob header because these get overwritten with the RC4 key, and the malware author could pre-populate this data if they wanted to with the RC4 key. Okay, so here's my final rule. Let's walk through it just real quick. The top part is just the bytes for our two blobs. Now we have our conditions. These all must be met for this rule to fire. Just make sure it's a PE file or a Windows executable, looking for the MZ header as well as the PE header. Next, we just need to validate that the blobs are contained somewhere in this sample. And then lastly, needs to have at least one or more resources, and then we'll use the math library just to calculate an entropy check. And I've made it 6 in this case. We could raise it up to about 7 or higher to make a more high fidelity rule. But again, I wanted a wide net to try to capture more of these samples. All right, so out of all these samples that I did find, let's look at some of the infection chains. All right, so this is WHITEDAGGER. We know it's a memory-only dropper. And here's some numbers. We have about 1.6K confirmed samples. And what I mean by that is we have some internal static analysis tools that can extract both configurations and embedded payloads. And we wrote a plugin to be able to try to automatically find the RC4 key, parse the resources, and extract an embedded payload. So if that all worked, yes, confirmed WHITEDAGGER. Now unconfirmed, we have about 2.6 unconfirmed, but yet result in known bad. And so that's where an instance of maybe some type of sandbox run happened. And we were still able to know that it was a malicious sample at the end of the day, whether it be through like memory dumps or some other type of Yarrow rule. And then lastly, we have like the last bucket of about 2K unknown. So these could be false positives. They have not been vetted. But these are our rough numbers. Now from these, almost always I saw the second stage being a payload called Dave Shell. Now Dave Shell is just what we call internally this open source project, the Shellcode Reflective DLL Injection project. This project will just take some type of payload, wrap it in this little shellcode loader, if you will. It'll just do what the Windows loader does. It'll map all the sections into memory, fix up all the relocations, do the imports, etc. So it's a great second stage payload, and it is shellcode. Now from Dave Shell, the third stage, if you will, I've observed all these different type of malware samples, and I've ranked them from most common to least common. So Emotet and TrickBot taking the top spots. Sometimes though, I also saw the third stage being something called Weird Loop. Now Weird Loop is another in-memory dropper. And all the next stages after that was a beacon stager that would download some beacon payload. All right, let's put some numbers to these. Emotet and TrickBot combined totaled about 1.5K unique samples, and the beacon stagers had about 200 unique samples. So pretty interesting. A lot of WHITEDAGGER out there dropping in a lot of different payloads. All right, turning our attention real quick before we're done. I'll just preface this with I'm not a threat intelligence analyst. I am just a malware analyst and reverse engineer. But I rummaged through our data and I wanted to ask the question of who's using WhiteDagger. And I found these different threat groups. Now, all of these threat groups are financially motivated. So if I had to guess, I'd say the authors of WhiteDagger are probably some type of middleman that just accepts payloads just to distribute other people's payloads. So there we go. Well, I hope everyone really enjoyed the talk and thank you for attending today. We'll leave it off with Dom.
Thank you. That, Blaine, was an awesome presentation. So we have a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is, what is a labeled IDB?
Oh, great question. So when we do a lot of our static analysis, we use a disassembly program, if you will. And the one that we most use most often on the team is the IDA Pro disassembler. IDA is the interactive disassembler. And it generates a IDB or an IDA database that stores all of your analysis. And what labeled means is when we're looking at the disassembly, we will often annotate it or label things such as local variables or different function names. And those labels or those annotations provide context. It could be something that I name, maybe like I call this function resolve APIs. And when I save all that analysis in a labeled IDB, if one of my colleagues were to download it and open it up, they would also get all the context that I've already pre-populated. So it makes reading something you've never seen before very easy. It's like reading a book at that point. There's no guessing. Someone's already kind of filled it in for you. And so that's super helpful and will really expedite your analysis.
Good. Thank you. Also, how do the lessons learned from WhiteDagger apply to other crypto algorithms?
It's a good question. I would say reading documentation is probably the biggest factor for this one. It took me a long time to piece it all together to figure out the inner workings, because at first glance it looked like asymmetric encryption, but in reality it was just symmetric encryption. So I would say go to the MSDN documentation, super helpful.
Excellent. And which Flare 9 challenge is authored by you, Blaine?
I don't know what number it will be this year, but it's called Pixel Poker. And your goal is to find one pixel out of like 400,000. So I hope you enjoy it.
And any plans to update Flare ID or add new features?
Maybe that was Flare VM, but yes, we are targeting an updated release in Q4, so this next quarter, the next few months. It's been a long time coming. We have been in the works of like over a year. It's just hard to find time. We're very busy, so.
Excellent. I think that's about it for questions right now. But before we go, we also have an annual CTF called Flare On. And today, on this very day, we start the 9th installment. Try it out and see how far you get. It's a load of fun. Also, keep an eye out for future the sample webinars, because we host them once a quarter. So the next one will be next year. Thank you for your time and joining, and have a great day.